Congratulations! If this is your first time using an FPGA-based SD series console, you are about to experience a wealth of flexibility and audio quality. This video-based Getting Started guide is designed as a simple introduction to the SD series. We hope it makes you want to delve deeper into this online program and the console itself. This introduction is broken down into the following sections. 1. Rack I/O. 2. Work surface orientation. 3. Basic work surface connections. 4. Session structure and configuration. 5. Suggested user options. 6. Basic channel control. 7. Basic output control. And 8. Dual solo buses. Before looking at the details of the console, you should spend a few moments becoming familiar with the SD9 work surface. The SD9 is driven using a combination of physical faders, buttons, assignable rotaries, and a touchscreen interface. The lower area of the surface has 24 touch-sensitive motorized faders split into 2 groups or banks of 12. You can build up to 4 banks of faders on each side. The bank select buttons switch between the banks, and pressing and holding a bank switch changes both the left and right sides to the same selection. Working around the surface, starting at the top right, there's a USB socket for saving and loading sessions, the controls for the screen brightness and lit lights, the headphone and talkback section, the solo bus and master level controls. Immediately to the right of the screen, there's a single strip of channel controls. These give access to the standard channel parameters, filters, EQ, dynamics, and inserts. Jumping over to the other side of the console, on the far left is the snapshot control panel and the macro buttons. The macro buttons are just user-programmable shortcut buttons. Just to the left of the touchscreen are the quick select buttons. These assign selected channel functions to the under-screen rotaries. So, if pan is selected on the quick select buttons, the rotaries under the screen control the pan for the channels on screen. If gain is selected on the quick select buttons, the 12 rotaries become gain controls. There are 2 buttons to the left of the under-screen rotaries that change the way that these rotaries work: the Option All button and the second function button. Pressing and holding the Option All while making an adjustment will actually make the adjustment on all the channels in the bank. This is great for quickly setting up lots of channels with the same basic settings, maybe switching EQs in or dialing in a high-pass filter. The second function button gives access to a set of additional functions. For example, the second function of an aux send level control is the aux pan and the pre-post switching. When second function is pressed, the screen changes the highlight of the controls to show this change of function. The 15-inch touchscreen is used for configuring the console, selecting parameters to adjust, naming, and almost every other function. The touchscreen is actually pressure sensitive, so it needs a firm touch. Light touches don't work so well, and if you stab it with your pen, you're likely to scratch the screen. On the master screen, most of the setup is driven by the large menu buttons across the top, so it's generally just a case of touching and selecting the options and settings you need. On the channel screens, there are specific areas of the screen to touch. For example, to open the input setup on a channel, you touch the top input area of the screen. To open the EQ or dynamics panel, touch the middle processing area of the screen. Auxes are selected by touching the rows of aux pots. And output setup is accessed by touching the bottom of the screen. As the various elements of the channel are touched, or as quick select buttons are pressed, assignments are made to the rotaries under the screen and to the channel strip to the right of the screen. The screen shows these assignments by surrounding the on-screen controls with a colored ring or halo. So, touch a row of auxes on the input channels, and that row shows pink rings on the screen controls as they are assigned to the rotaries under the screen. Touch an input channel to select it, and its background turns gold. All of the controls controls on that channel are now assigned to the strip of channel controls to the right of the touchscreen. There is one rotary that needs a special mention, the touch and turn control. If you need to make adjustments to the settings or parameters on the master screen, for example, FX settings or matrix send levels, the control to be adjusted is touched on screen, and that parameter can then be adjusted using the touch and turn. As with the input channels, the colored halo will follow the assignments made. Finally, it's worth locating a couple of the physical connections you might need now. The headphone output is on the right side of the console just under the wrist rest. And if you're using a D-rack, its Cat5 connection plugs into the rear of the desk. And please, make sure your keyboard and mouse are plugged in. The SD9 can be specified with either single or dual PSUs. These supplies are located internally on the rear of the console, and if fitted with dual PSU, they are hot swappable. The local I/O connections on the SD9 are found on the back panel and are clearly labeled. Mic line 1 to 8. Line output 1 to 8. Stereo AES inputs 1 and 2. Stereo AES outputs 1 and 2. There are also connections for 2 D-racks. As you look at the rear panel, the right-hand connection is D-rack 1 and the left-hand connection is D-rack 2. The third external I/O option is a 56 I/O-compatible MADI connection that can be used for recording or for further Digico I/O expansion. The keyboard and mouse connection are found on the lower rear section, and it is strongly recommended that these are connected at all times the console is in operation. Next to these connections is the VGA output for a dedicated overview screen and network connection for remote control and mirroring. How these can be used is fully detailed in the basic connection section of this video. The master screen can be considered as the control hub of the console, and normally is the starting point for any new session. Touching the tabs across the top of the screen will reveal a drop-down list of further menus or open the control panel for that function. The master screen also displays the current software version running on the console, as well as the console status bar, and as a default, the system status indicators. Both the status bar and the system status indicators position can be moved by touch or positioned on the SD9's overview screen by using the mouse. The system status indicators provide a quick visual status of the various onboard systems or connected racks. The indicator will either show a grey box, nothing connected, a red error indicator showing that a resource is not responding as expected, or a green OK. This signifies that the resource is operating as expected. It is worth noting that an error warning does not mean that something has failed, only that the console is not seeing what it is expecting. A good example of this is if only one of the 2 console power supplies is turned on. You'll see an error next to environment. Once you have switched on the second supply, a green OK will be shown, as that console is expecting to see 2 supplies switched on. The Options panel, accessed from the button on the master screen, provides many ways to customize the way in which the console interacts with you. This allows you to tailor it to either your preference or for the job you are doing. For example, a monitor engineer may well have a different set of options or preferences to a front-of-house engineer. We're not going to go through every option in this tutorial, but just talk about some of the commonly used ones and explain how they affect the way the console will interact with you. As you go through the options, you will see that some of the settings are marked with a small red asterisk. These settings are not session-specific, but stored as a console setting. The settings that are not marked with the asterisk are stored with each session and set when each session is loaded. The options are split into tabs, grouping commands together by type. So let's start with the first tab. There are a couple of settings that are worth mentioning here. The Auto Expand EQ and Dynamics settings control if the large EQ and Dynamics panels open automatically when channel settings are adjusted, and how long the panels stay open for when you have finished adjusting them. The default setting is 2 seconds, which some users find a little quick. It's also worth switching on the Auto Cancel Second Function option. Accidentally leaving the second function switched on will affect some important console operations. Mute becomes hard mute when second function is on. Aux sends to stereo auxes becomes the aux pan control. So unless you are totally sure that you will not leave second function accidentally enabled, it's worth considering setting this option to automatically cancel it for you. At the bottom of this tab is the option to have the screen assignment follow bank selection. When you're first setting the console up, you often find yourself switching between banks and screens. So to speed the process up, enabling this option reduces the number of button presses. Each time you select a bank, the screen assignment will follow. However, once you're done setting up and into mixing mode, you might find you need to switch this option off. The second tab relates to fader options. You can have touching the fader select the channel on screen. This assigns the channel to the channel controls down the right-hand side of the screen. You can switch on the 0 dB detent for all faders too. However, it's the fader touch control that needs a mention. There are 2 settings for this, free and protected. When in protected mode, the faders need to detect a positive touch before they will move. This means that you can't knock them from their current position. You have to positively touch and push the fader for it to move. In free mode, the faders do not wait for this touch before they are allowed to move. The next set of options are the solo options. If you're a monitor engineer, these will probably need setting. The Solo assigns aux to faders and Solo assigns aux to rotaries options enables you to quickly dial in aux mixes. When aux to faders is enabled, soloing an aux master drops the channel sends to that aux onto faders. Similarly, the aux to rotaries option puts the sends to the soloed aux on the top row of the underscreen rotaries. It's unlikely that you would use both of these together, but you have the option. Digico consoles do not have a channel select button. Channels are generally selected by touching them on screen. However, some users like to use the solo function to select the channel. This means that as you solo a channel to listen to it, it is automatically selected and assigned to the channel control. The Disabled tab allows you to switch off a couple of console functions. The important one is the Disable Hard Mute function. This stops you accidentally hard muting channels, generally as a consequence of leaving second function switched on. The Meters tab sets meter-related functions. Meter ballistics, the size of the meters displayed on the overview screen, and the metering point. While these don't necessarily need adjusting, some users prefer to have their input channel metering point set pre-trim. This means that their input meter shows them the result of the head amp gain rather than the output of the digital trim module. For example, if your digital trim was turned down, your head amp gain was high, and if your meter was post-trim, the level on the resulting meter would probably look okay, and you might be unaware that you are clipping your head amp. Flipping the metering point to pre-trim would show this problem immediately. The next tab contains session-related settings. These require a little explanation. The first two settings, Load and Save Startup Session, control the behavior of the console when it is turned on and shut down. Normally, when you turn the console off and then switch it back on again, you want it to come back on in the same state it was when you shut it down. This is achieved using the startup session. When you switch the console off, the software saves the state of the current session as this special startup session. Then, when you turn it back on, it is this session that gets loaded, returning you to your last working point. There are times when you don't want this to happen. If you opt not to load the startup session, it comes up as a standard default blank session. If you choose not to save the startup session, it will load the last saved startup session. This is useful if you always want the desk to boot up with a known session that won't get overwritten on shutdown. Also in this tab is the option to enable Waves Multi-Rack. You should only enable this if your SD9 has been upgraded with the appropriate Waves software. The option to enable the console network is also here. And if you want to network your console to another SD9 or PC remote, then you'll need to enable this option. Finally, for this tab, the mirroring mode is set here. There are 4 options, and they set the way the mirrored devices work with each other. The audio settings and commands are always fully mirrored and therefore the same, but you may want to change the way the physical surface interacts with the mirrored device. It's worth remembering that the equivalent setting on the mirrored console or PC remote will also need setting. In full mirror mode, the mirrored devices will fully mirror virtually all button presses, and this means that they are always displaying the same information. If you mirror 2 SD9s together and put them in expander mode, the 2 surfaces will act like a single work surface. You can view different banks and channels on each surface, but operations like solo assigns aux to faders are performed on both surfaces. The remote mode separates all work surface interaction between the 2 devices. They operate entirely independently. This is the best setting for 2-person operation across a pair of mirrored consoles. The one-way mirror mode is designed for a specific mirroring application with the SD7 console, so can be safely ignored on the SD9. The final tab, Status, allows you to see or ignore system alerts and status indicators. It's probably a good idea to have both of these switched on so that you are aware of any console environment alerts. You can also set how long these warnings are shown for. In the top left corner of the screen is the Systems menu. The first tab on the list opens the Console Diagnostics panel, which provides information on the status of the console hardware and connected devices, plus it lists the current engine and surface codes. A useful shortcut to note here is that the diagnostics page can be accessed by touching on the OK or Error System status indicators that are displayed on the master screen. The oscillator panel sets the frequency and level of the oscillator signal when it is routed into an input channel. If routed onto a stereo channel, you can set the oscillator to provide a stereo ID, which momentarily dips the left leg of the signal or provides glitz, which sequentially dips both the left and then the right legs of the signal. The oscillator settings are session-specific and will be reset if the default All button is pressed in the Session Structure panel. Towards the bottom of the System menu, you will see 3 buttons which provide specific console reset functions. If accessed using the touchscreen, then a confirmation is required before the instruction is carried out. If the reset instruction is given using the keyboard function keys, then no confirmation will be asked for. The reset effects command will only interrupt audio being processed by the FX rack, whereas reset engine will stop all audio for about 1 second. Resetting the surface will return the controllers to the position they were in before the reset and will not affect the audio. At the very bottom of the System tab, you will see Shutdown. By pressing this, you'll initiate the power down procedure for the SD9. You will be asked to confirm the shutdown and will be prompted to save your session if the console has detected any significant changes since the last save. Once the system is shut down, an on-screen message will appear prompting you to switch off the SD9's power supplies. Console Security lets you customize which functions on the SD9 are accessible to the user. There are 3 different states of operation for you to choose from. Setup mode allows the user access to all functions on the console with no restrictions. In live mode, by using the Set Live Restrictions menu, you are able to define what channel and console functionality the user is able to control. Once you have defined your setup, you can prevent changes to this by setting a custom password and selecting Secure Live Mode. These settings are stored within your session and will be restored when you load the session. When Live Mode is selected, Secure Live will be displayed in the console status bar. Unattended mode locks out all functions and controls on the surface until the selected password has been entered. Should you forget your password, an override password can be obtained from Digico support. The next tab you will see on the master screen is Files. Touching on this tab will again drop down further options, the first of which is Session Structure. By touching on Session Structure, you will open a panel that allows you to configure the console's available resources to match your requirements. When starting a new session, it is important to decide how many of each type of bus is required. While changes to session structure can be made once a session has been started, it is best to try and set these parameters before configuring the session. The structure will set the number and type of AUX and groups channels and allow you to choose which part of the new session will be cleared and reset. There is also an option to automatically route the inputs and outputs from channel types that you have opted to clear. To adjust any of the channel allocations, touch on the associated channel count box and either enter a number using the pop-up number keypad or adjust using the assigned touch-turn controller. The SD9 has 48 flexi input channels which can be set to be mono or stereo in the channel setup panel. There are 16 flexi buses that can be either AUX or group buses. As you increase the number of buses, you will see the available resources decreasing accordingly to the number boxes at the bottom of the panel. In addition to these 16 flexi buses, there is also a master bus that can be either stereo or LCR and a fixed 12x8 matrix. Once you configure the buses to your requirements, pressing the Restructure button will build your session. Towards the right-hand side of this panel is the default All button. Pressing the default All button, followed by the Restructure button, will automatically configure a new session with 4 mono aux group buses and 4 stereo aux group buses. The first 48 rack inputs will be routed to input channels 1 to 48, and the master bus is routed to local outputs 1 and 2, and also to rack 1 outputs 1 and 2. All input channels are routed to the master bus, and the console headphones will be fed by the master bus when nothing else is soloed. Load Session gives you access to any previously saved SD9 sessions located in either the console's projects folder on the internal drive or on an external USB drive. This selection is done by touching the internal or removable button located in the top left-hand corner of the screen. Once a drive has been selected, the drive directory will appear in the left-hand side of the display. Each folder can be expanded by clicking on the plus symbol to its left. The list can be scrolled using the scroll bar to its right. Touch the button and folder from which you want to load your session. Any SD session that is located in the selected folder will be displayed in the session list detailing the last time it was saved, and for SD9 sessions, the channel and bus configuration will also be displayed. On the right-hand side of the session list, you will see the rename file and delete file. These actions can be carried out on any file in the list apart from the currently loaded session. Touching on a session file will highlight your selection and the load button will be enabled. Touch on this to load the selected session. Also highlighted is the partial load button located in the top right-hand corner. Partial load is a way of loading certain parts of one session and merging them into the currently loaded session, for example, the setup of your input channels or your snapshot information. Once you have decided what parts of the session you require, touch on Load, and the selected parts will be loaded, overwriting what is in your current session. There are 2 options for saving your session: Save Session and Save as New File. Touching Save Session will overwrite the current session file, providing that the session has a file name and has been previously saved. If the session has not been previously saved, or you select Save as New File, the Save Session display will open. At the top of the Save Session display are 2 text boxes showing a file name and a session title. To edit these, touch the relevant text box, then enter the new name or title either with the on-screen or external keyboard, and press OK. To overwrite another session, or to save the session in a new folder but with a previously used name, touch the session of that name and its name will appear in the File Name box. The location of the session file to be saved, as with Load Session, is defined in the directory in the left-hand side of the display. Each folder can be expanded by clicking on the plus symbol to its right. The list can be scrolled using the scroll bar to its right. Touch the button and folder within which you want to save the session. To create a new folder in which to save your session, select the location of the folder in the way that has just been demonstrated and touch the New Folder button in the right-hand side of the display. Next, you need to name the folder using the external keyboard. To rename a folder, touch the folder within the directory. Touch the Rename Folder button in the right-hand side of the display and type the folder's new name. To delete a folder, touch the Delete Folder button in the right-hand side of the display. Touch the folder to be deleted and touch Yes in the confirmation pop-up which appears. The next two items contained with the Files tab are Load Presets and Save Presets. The Presets file contains all the presets that are currently stored on the console. Loading a presets file will add to and not overwrite any presets already present on the console. More detailed information on presets can be found in the Input Channels section. The final two items we're going to look at under the Files tab are Global Set to Defaults and Session Report. First, let's look at Global Set to Defaults. This is a very useful tool because it allows you to quickly perform certain tasks across the whole console, for example, muting all input channels or moving all group faders to 0 dB. On the left-hand side of the panel, you'll see a list of the various channel types on the console. Using the touchscreen, select the channel type or types you require. Once a channel type has been selected, the default controllers that can be applied to that channel type will be highlighted on the right-hand side of the panel. Touching the controller option will instantly apply the instruction to the channel type. You can undo the last instruction by touching on the Undo button on the top left-hand corner of that panel. The final option in the Files menu is Session Report. By touching on this, the console generates a document that details the structure and channel information contained within your session. As can be seen, software version information and channel names, as well as input and output routing information, are all contained within the document, which can be saved on the console's project folder as an RTF file. This file can then be loaded into nearly any word processor and can form the basis of your channel list. Contained within the Layouts tab are the fader banks, channel list, and transport control menus. When selected, the fader banks menu displays a pictorial version of the console's channel banks and provides options for labeling and managing the layout. The SD9 has 8 banks of 12 faders, 4 on the left-hand side of the surface and 4 on the right, each of which has a multicolor LCD display. The labeling within the LCD displays can be edited using the text boxes in the bottom left-hand corner of the display. When a new default session is created, or when Rebuild Banks is selected in Session Structure, the top row of the LCD displays a short version of the channel type. CH for input channels, AUX for AUX channels, GRP for group channels, Matrix for matrix channels, and CG for control group channels. This is followed by the channel number range, and the bottom row displays the channel type in full. To edit either row, first select a bank to edit. Touch its text box. Type in the new name using the on-screen or external keyboard, and press OK. The color of the LCD is determined by the first channel contained within the bank. Just above the bank labeled text box are 3 function buttons: Swap, Move, and Copy To. Once you have selected a bank, touching on any of these buttons will turn them light gray, and a red instruction text will appear at the top of the panel. Touching on another bank will carry out the instruction and rebuild the surface accordingly. The final 2 buttons on this panel dictate whether the selected bank's channel information, such as fader position and metering information, is displayed on the overview screen, master screen, or not at all. Further information of the overview screen can be found in the basic connections sections. The channel list is a list of all types of channel that exist within the current session. When opening the panel for the first time, you'll see the list is in a collapsed form separated into the different channel types. Touching on the down arrow in the left-hand column next to the channel type will expand the list to show all of the selected channels of that type. For example, once input channels is expanded, the name, input, insert and output routing and channel location information are displayed for each of the 48 input channels. Touching on any channel will highlight it and also select on the surface the bank where the first instance of that channel occurs. To collapse the list, touch on the arrow in the left-hand column. The channel list is also used when assigning channels to the surface when building custom banks. For more information on this, please see the Input Channels section. The final option under that Layout tab is Transport Control. This display shows the MTC being received via the MIDI in connector when MIDI is enabled in the Snapshot Transport Control panel. For more information on transport control operation, please refer to the Snapshot section. The Solo button at the top of the master screen opens the Solo setup panel. This shows you the settings for the console's 2 Solo buses. A monitor engineer might want to use one Solo bus for a wedge and the other for in-ear monitors so that they can accurately monitor the aux mixes that are being sent to the stage. Either of these Solo buses can be mono or stereo, and the buttons across the top of the panel that set the PFL or AFL position for each bus also exist on the console work surface. Either bus can be set to multi or single mode, allowing you to have several channels soloed at one time or only one at a time. The No Solo button opens a panel where you can select any existing group or aux bus as the signal you will hear on the Solo bus when nothing is actually soloed. Often this will be the master bus, but it could even be one of the auxes feeding a specific stage mix. Both buses have independent insert points that use the normal send-return routing panel and a direct out, which is where you would set the routing to your wedge or IEM. By default, both of the Solo buses feed the console's headphone output, and you will see the buttons highlighted in blue that activate this. The buses can also be delayed to compensate for the time difference between the direct headphone signal and the main audio reaching you. Solo bus levels can be adjusted by pressing one of the Solo level controls at the bottom of the panel and using the touch turn, but there is also a dedicated Solo 1 level control on the work surface. There is an option to use the Master Level Work Surface control to adjust the Solo 2 Master Level, and the button to activate this is on the bottom right of the Solos panel. Solo trims can be changed with the dedicated work surface rotaries. The last feature in this panel is Auto Solo. If a channel is set to Auto Solo, it will always be soloed whenever another channel solo is active. You might, for example, want to put your FX return channels in auto solo so you can always hear them when another individual channel is soloed. You can see a list of the channels that are currently in auto solo mode, and you have buttons to globally enable or disable the function. The Matrix button on the master screen gives you access to the 12 input, 8 output matrix. Matrix inputs are the vertical columns, and you can select which particular sources are coming in by touching the top of one of these to open the Matrix Input Setup panel. Touching the Matrix Input button will then allow you to choose from any rack input or internal source, including channels, groups, auxes, test tone and noise. These matrix inputs are mono, but you can use the ripple route function to assign several inputs at the same time. To send these inputs to the matrix outputs, you need to touch any combination of the rotary controls on the screen and then use the touch turn control and button to adjust the level and on-off states. When controls are selected, they are highlighted in green, and you will notice a flashing red clear button to remind you that you still have controls active. This is because you can adjust multiple controls at the same time, so just touching another one will add to the selection, and then you may well be adjusting things that you didn't intend to. There is a button marked Single in the Touch Turn Assignment section at the bottom of the panel, and if this is pressed, you will only be able to activate one matrix send control at a time. The next one you select will cancel the previous selection. There is also an All button that automatically selects every send control in the matrix, but this is much less likely to be used on a regular basis. Also on this panel, you can create matrix presets, which will store the input routes and send levels for the entire matrix and allow you to recall either or both of these things. In addition, the entire matrix can be made safe from snapshot recall with the button in the bottom left-hand corner of the panel. The FX button on the master screen opens the internal FX rack. Unless you have already created some effects, the rack will be empty. You can have up to 8 stereo FX units selected from a choice of 33 factory presets which are marked with a red padlock. These can then be edited, allowing you to create your own user presets. To put a new effects unit in the rack, press the New button in the top left corner and then select a type of effect from the list on the left. Now select a preset from the list on the right. To remove the effects unit from the rack, just deselect it. Pressing the effects button on the unit itself will open the presets panel. Once you have put an effects unit in the rack, you then have the option to edit its parameters and then create a new preset by pressing the New button in the presets panel. You'll be prompted to name it, and it will then be added to the current effects group. When you have some user presets, they can be edited and updated with the new settings. Just press the Update button and then press the preset that you want to update. Presets can also be renamed and deleted in the same way. You can also create your own groups of presets by pressing the New Group button and typing a new name. This creates a new user preset in a new group. Once you have created effects units in the rack, their inputs and outputs will automatically appear in the routing panel. You will need to route signals to the effect, often from an aux bus output, and then route the effects returns into normal input channels. The Graphic EQs button opens the display for the 16 internal 32-band graphic EQs. These EQs can be applied to any type of channel, either input or output, normally using the channel insert A or B. There is a large EQ display at the bottom of the panel and an up arrow button on the right that expands the panel to show all of the EQs. The 16 smaller displays can be touched to select an EQ to adjust, and this will appear in the larger display at the bottom of the panel. Now, touching this larger graphic EQ allows you to use the 24-channel faders for EQ adjustment. The highlighted area shows you which bands are being adjusted. Just touch the screen again to select a different set of EQ bands. There is also an overall trim control and an EQ on-off button. These EQs can be linked together either globally by pressing the All button to make the same adjustment to all of them, or by ganging groups of them together. You may, for example, want to put a pair of mono EQs across a stereo bus. To gang them, touch the first member of the gang and press the Build Gang button above the large on-screen faders. Now touch each smaller EQ unit that you want to include in the gang. Pressing the Build Gang button again ends the process. To make another gang, repeat the process and you will notice that a new color has been assigned to the new gang. To edit an existing gang, touch one of that gang's members and press the Build Gang button. Now, touch an existing gang member to remove it from the gang, or a different EQ unit to add it to the gang. There is also a flat button to reset all of the selected EQ bands from 0 dB, and a presets button allowing you to save and recall your favorite settings. Each separate EQ unit also has its own safe button to prevent snapshots changing that particular graphic EQ settings. Pressing the Control Groups button on the master screen opens the Control Groups panel. The 8 control groups are more often known as VCAs or CGs. Any type of channel can be a member of a CG, and to add channels to a CG, just press the Join Leave button for one of the CGs and then press the Channel Select buttons to add them. You will now see the list of members for each CG on the screen. When you have finished, press the Join Leave button again to exit this mode. The CGs can be named by touching the white label box and typing. The CG faders, mutes and solos will normally appear on the 4th bank in the right-hand section. Selecting that bank will show you each CG, its list of members and its various controls. One of these controls is the CG Mode Select button, where you can choose to have your CGs in VCA style, moving fader or mute-only mode. VCA is the default mode, but mute-only is often used if you want to create a mute group where the CG fader has no effect on the audio. Actually, even in VCA and moving fader modes, the CG mute still works. Whenever a CG mute is active on a channel, you'll see a blue CG mute indicator at the bottom of the screen strip. A channel can be a member of several CGs. For example, you have one CG for the entire band, but also have a separate CG for each group of instruments, vocals, keyboards, guitars, etc. These CGs will be in series, so muting any of the CGs will mute all of its member channels. For a channel to be unmuted, all of the CGs that it is a member of must be unmuted. You can, however, at any time override a channel CG mute using the channel's own mute button. As soon as the CG is muted again, this override will be cancelled. On the far right-hand side of the master screen is the Setup tab. Touching on this will reveal a further 4 options: Audio I/O, Audio Sync, Macros, and Talkback. From the audio I/O and sync panels, connections to both onboard and external audio and clock sources are managed. Both of these panels are covered in detail in the Advanced Connection section of this DVD. In the macro editor, you may have noticed the capture button. Enabling capture puts the editor into listen mode, and it records all your button presses and control adjustments. If you're not sure where to find the command you need, this can work as a quick way of getting going. If I put capture mode on and make some console adjustments, you'll see the list become populated. We then take capture mode off by pressing the capture button again. You can see in the list of commands that each aux muted, in this case auxes 1 through 4, appears as a separate entry. While there's nothing wrong with this, we can tidy it up a bit. If we remove all but the first line of macro entry, we're left with just aux 1 being muted. But the original captured programming muted auxes 1, 2, 3 and 4. Looking at the entry, there are 2 columns, from and to. These 2 columns define the range of channels that the command will act on. Touching them allows us to edit them. So if I touch the to column, I can use the value plus button to increment up to 4. Now when I fire this macro, it will mute auxes 1, 2, 3 and 4. If we touch the value column, we can change the nature of the action performed. Instead of this macro muting the auxes, I can set it to toggle the mute state. So alternative presses of the macro will apply mute on, then mute off to the aux channels. Taking this one step further, we can make this programming a little more intelligent. Whenever a macro button is pressed, it performs what we call an on action. This is the first press of the macro button. The next press of the same macro performs an off action. Usually, we program these on and off actions to be the inverse of each other. So, instead of having alternative presses of the macro button just toggle the state of a controller, we can program the macro button so that the first press is a definite mute on command and the second press of the macro button is a definite mute off command. But what advantage does this give us? In our toggle the mute of 4 auxes example earlier, all the macro did was toggle the state of the mute. So if aux 1 had been muted and auxes 2, 3 and 4 had been unmuted, firing the macro would have just toggled or inverted this state. If we actually wanted them all to be the same, then we have to split the actions up into the 2 states, put the mute on and take the mute off. We'll start a new macro and quickly build it to switch the channel mutes on for auxes 1 to 4 and assign it macro button 2. Note that the action switch under the button assignments on screen is set to on. This means that when macro button 2 is pressed, it will perform the on action. That is to mute auxes 1 to 4. We now need to build the corresponding off action. So we close the editor and from the macro panel duplicate the macro we have just built. Press the duplicate button. Then select the macro to duplicate. The editor will open ready to edit the new duplicated macro. The macro is actually almost ready by default. It is assigned to the same macro button but as an off action. All we need to do is change the action performed from on to off using the value plus, and we're done. When you fire these macros, you'll see that regardless of the state of the aux mutes, firing these macros will make them all the same and perform the required action. Ultimately, almost any of the console parameters or functions can be programmed to a macro. If you're not sure where to start, try to capture the function, but macros will save you time and give you immediate access to those commonly used functions. talkback panel is the interface between the Surface talk button, the talkback channel, the talk to aux function, and output routing. First, let's start with the talkback input channel. The talkback channel is slightly different to other channel types in that it has no fader, mute, or output routing controls. It simply allows you to apply processing, inserts, and dynamic control to your chosen talk input without using up one of your 40 input channels. Touching at the top of the talkback channel opens the talkback setup panel, where you can select from which socket your signal is sourced for both the main and alternative input. The same input panel is opened when you touch the input box in the talkback panel. If you change the input source here, the same source will be selected on the talkback channel. Similarly, the gain control in the talkback panel is the same gain control as seen on the talkback input channel strip. Thus, any changes to one will be seen on the other. The two boxes on the left-hand side of the talkback panel control the routing of the talkback signal. Touch on the lower of the two boxes and the direct output routing panel appears. From here, the talkback audio signal can either be internally routed to graphic EQs or internal effects, or to physical output sockets on any connected rack or on the local I/O. Touch on the last box in the upper left corner and the talk to aux setup panel opens. From here, you can create a group of auxes which the talk signal will be routed when the Surface talk button is pressed or the talk button in the talkback panel is touched. Let's take a look at the input section channel strip. To do this, simply push the Screen Assign in the left-hand section of the lower panel above the Bank Assign buttons. Although at first the console looks different to an analog console, the design concept is in fact very similar. You will notice 12 channel strips on the screen that are laid out like a traditional channel. At the top, you have an input gain, then EQ and dynamics, followed by the aux sends, and finally the bus routing, fader, and mute. The screen is a pressure touchscreen, so firmly pressing, not fast tapping, will assign and open sections of the channel strip. Routing inputs to channels could not be simpler. Select the channel you want to route and press the very top of that channel strip on the screen. This will open the setup panel for that channel. You then have some routing options. The first choice to make is, do you want this channel to be a mono or stereo channel? All channels on the SD9 are flexi channels, so can all be quickly switched to stereo. In this instance, let's look at a mono channel. Each mono channel has two inputs, a main and an alt input. This means all mono channels can have two physical inputs connected to them. These can be quickly switched as required. They are ideally for running backup or spare inputs into a channel, with the benefit of not taking up work surface faders or channel processing. To switch between the main and alt, just press the desired input switch on screen. Let's press the main input routing button. Now you can see an expanded input panel that shows you the currently connected racks and devices. This will normally include MISC, where you will locate your tone generator and pink noise, for example, local I/O, This is the I/O on the rear of the console work surface. 1. Rack 1 and 2. Rack 2, one for each D-rack frame that is connected. MADI. This might be available if you have a MADI recorder such as Pro Tools or Logic Audio connected to the system. Let's press the first rack option and you will see a further expanded view, this time to show you the cards on the rack. Press the card you want to access and now you can select down to the physical XLR input you want on this channel. Pressing the input you want will bring that input into the channel strip. This section only covers the basic routing of a channel. To find out more about ripple routing and the other features of this setup panel, please watch the Input Channel section. To close the Input Setup panel, press at the top of the input strip again, or press the Close button and the panel will close. Using the Quick Select section of the work surface, press the Gain button. This will assign the row of rotaries under the screen to gain control. This will allow you to use the rotary to accurately set the gain of the channels you have just routed into that section. If you would like to access the other features of the channel processing, you can assign channels by pressing them on screen. The best area to press is the large EQ display for each channel. Once pressed, a channel will highlight, and at this time the channel controls to the right of the screen are assigned to the selected channel. In this area, you will find EQ controls, basic dynamics controls, and channel switching for inserts and direct outputs. To interrogate the units in more detail, pressing them will expand the view of both the EQ and dynamic sections. When expanded, the EQ controls remain on the right-hand side rotaries, but when looking at the dynamics units, the rotaries below the screen assign to the dynamics controls and highlight on the screen with the halo. Pressing the row of dynamics controls you want will assign them to the rotaries. On the SD series of consoles, you have some enhanced dynamics units only available on Digico consoles. These advanced units can be assigned to either input channels or output channels. These include powerful 4-band dynamic EQ and multi-band compression units. These advanced dynamics are mentioned in greater detail in the Input Channel section, including some ideas of how they can help you. Beneath the dynamics units, you'll see a row of auxiliaries. We have already discussed how the busing of the console can be tailored to your requirement. The AUXes available will be the same as you allocated in the session structure panel we covered earlier. To assign the auxiliaries to the rotaries, you can either touch a row on screen or press the AUX button in the Quick Select area. Once they are assigned, the screen scroll will move you up and down the available AUXes. The rotary will now adjust the send level of the auxiliary, and the button will turn the send off and on. When the second function button is selected, the rotary controls the pan on stereo AUXes, and the button conveniently switches between pre-mute, pre-fade post-mute, and post-fader. On screen at the bottom of the channel, you have the output routing. Pressing the lower section opens the routing options for bus routing and insert sends. The routing is performed by simply pressing on screen the desired location. Each channel can be routed to any group bus, multiple direct outputs, and a single insert point that can either be pre or post the channel's processing. On the work surface, you have both a fader and a mute. These are self-explanatory, but it's worth highlighting when in second function mode, the mute button acts as a hard mute. This mutes the input at the top of the channel strip and is ideal to silence a faulty input, etc. When a channel is in hard mute, the channel's mute button flashes to indicate the difference between standard and hard muting. Now we have a channel input and output routed, let's look at the different output channels. All the group, aux, master and matrix outputs have the same processing as the input channels. This means, in a lot of cases, no further processing needs to be inserted into the bus output signal path. On the work surface, you will note some fader banks are labeled as GRP, aux, matrix, and CG. These will normally be found on a standard session spread across both the left and the right third fader bank buttons. Let's look at group and master output buses first. Please press the red group bank button and then select Screen Assign. The screen should now show the group bus outputs. These are displayed as red channel strips. The master bus will also be located here, either as the first stereo bus or an LCR master. Assigning the processing controls is done in the same way as the input channel. This includes all the EQ and dynamics assignment. If you press the bottom of the strip on screen, it will expand the output routing panel. This allows you to select the physical output for bus or route the assigned group bus directly to other group buses. Moving to the aux output strips is as simple as selecting the correct fader bank button, not forgetting to reassign the screen view if required. The aux output channels are purple in color. Again, these have the same processing as the input channels, and the assignment procedure is the same. Pressing the top of the on-screen aux channel display will expand some options of the assigned auxiliary bus. You have the ability to copy the settings from another aux bus directly to this bus, and a one-button way of globally changing the aux bus to be either pre-fader, pre-fader post-mute, or post-fade. If you press the bottom of the strip on screen, it will expand the output routing panel. This allows you to select the physical output for bus or route an insert point on the bus output. This insert point could be used for inserting one of the internal graphic EQs or routing to an external processor. If you would like to use one of our onboard effects units, but have not built any in the onboard effects rack, you can simply press Effects Output. This will then allow you to create the desired effects from the available effects library. This will perform all the output routing and build the effects unit both on the output bus and the effects rack. You will need to route the FX return into the channel. This is done by going to the desired input channel bank and routing the input in the normal way. Again, the FX are located as internal signals under the effects routing option. We don't cover the output matrix in this section, but an explanation on this can be found in the master screen section. We will, though, look at simple CG or VCA assignment. CG stands for control group, and it is no more than a digital VCA. Select the CG fader bank and then press the appropriate LCD function button to open the LCD menu options. The display above fader number 4 should indicate Join CG. Press the button beneath this option. In the display, now it will say the CG numbers and underneath Join CG. Press the button for the desired CG. let's say CG1. And now, all the input channel LCDs will say Join CG1. Pressing the Channel Select button on the required channels will assign them to being members of CG1. You can assign across banks as required. More CG options are explained in the Master section. All Digico consoles come with dual solo buses. These make it convenient to mix monitors to both wedges and in-ears accurately. They can also offer some great flexibility for front-of-house monitoring. Let's first look at how you can select between two solo buses. Select the aux output fader bank to the work surface. Press the appropriate LCD function button and the display above fader number 2 should now say Solo Choice. Pressing the button beneath this display will toggle between the following options: Solo 1, Solo 2, Solo 1 and 2. The solo bus assignment can be altered on all channels and bus outputs to offer user flexibility. It is also possible to select some options for each solo bus on the console and your monitor preferences. Select the master screen by pressing Master Screen. You will notice a solo option at the top of the screen. Pressing this will open up a solo setup panel for Solo 1 and Solo 2. Not all the options are covered in this section, just the ones to get you started. Multi-mode. This allows multiple solos to be pressed at any one time. Single mode. In this mode, only one solo can be assigned at any one time. When the next solo is pressed, it will automatically cancel the previous solo. No solo. This allows you to select the signal that is routed to the solo output when no solo buttons are selected. This could be the master bus, or maybe the lead singer's aux bus. Headphones. This routes the solo bus to the headphone output. There is a dedicated section of the work surface allocated to the solo buses. Located on the surface are some of the solo options, as well as a dedicated trim control for Solo 1 output. The second rotary in this section is default set to a master bus trim. This, however, can be allocated to the Solo 2 trim if preferred. This is performed in the Solo 2 panel by pressing the Assign to Master level. On the work surface, there is a clear LED indication showing the current function of the rotary. Solo in place. This is switched on the work surface by pressing and holding in the SIP button on the work surface solo section. This completes the Getting Started section of the program, and you should now be confident of getting signals in and, more importantly, out of your SD9. Please take some time to have a practice with the assignment and speed of getting around the work surface. There is a lot more flexibility and power in the console than is covered in this section, but details on these are explained later on. Once all your physical audio connections are made, you'll need to configure your session for these connections. So, on your master screen, touch the Setup menu and select Audio I/O. The panel that opens is divided into 4 main sections. The left-hand side of the panel lists your physical ports, the local I/O, the 2 DRAC Cat5 connections, and the standard MADI port. Touching the ports selects them, and the currently selected port is highlighted blue. The top strip allows you to name and configure your selected port or rack. The large graphic in the middle of the screen represents the selected rack. Touching this picture selects individual sockets and cards so that you can name and configure them. Often, in an install or touring system, naming sockets makes setup and routing quicker and easier. The bottom section of this panel is the setup panel for the selected card in a rack or socket. Let's look at these in a little more detail. The audio I/O configuration in a session needs to match the connected hardware. If you're using the standard MADI to connect to Digico rack, then select port 3. Then, on the top strip, touch the down-pointing arrow under Device Type and select the appropriate device from the list. Now press the big red Conform All Ports button in the bottom left-hand corner of the panel. The console will automatically configure all your ports to match the connected hardware. It's worth selecting each port in turn and checking that everything looks right. You can manually configure the hardware too. With the rack selected, touch one of the cards within the rack. Now, in the bottom Card Setup section, select the correct card from the drop-down list. On a D rack, you can only do this for the second output card. The rest of the rack is a fixed configuration. But for DigiRacks and other MADI-connected racks, each card needs to be set correctly. You can now name your ports, cards, and sockets. If you have two D racks connected, you might, for example, name them Stage Left and Stage Right. With the first D rack port selected, touching the first socket, here labeled 1, Mic 1, selects that socket. Now, in the bottom section of the screen, we can rename the port. For example, call it Kick, and we can rename the first card. Here, I've called it Drums. Each card is 8 sockets, inputs or outputs. On the D rack, they are arranged in horizontal rows, and for the larger racks or standard MADI connections, the cards are arranged vertically. You'll see that once you have a socket selected, the properties for that socket can be configured: phantom power, pads, etc. The final part of the basic audio I/O setup is to configure a record copy. This is the Copy Audio 2 function in the top right-hand corner of the Audio I/O panel. Here's how it works. From the port list, select your first D rack, probably port 1. Now from the drop-down list in the Copy Audio 2 menu, select port 3, which is a standard MADI port by default. With this copy in place, any audio coming to the console down the first Cat5 port from the D rack is copied straight back out to the first 32 channels of the MADI stream. Connect your recorder to the MADI port and hit Record, and you're capturing the audio without any processing. The copy is post-mic gain, but not processed by the desk in any way, a recording of the raw sources. If you have two D racks, you can copy both of them to the MADI port. Then you get all 32 channels from the first D rack and the first 24 channels from the second D rack, making up the 56 channels of a standard MADI stream. Once you've recorded the audio, maybe during sound check, you will need to listen back to it. You can do this with the press of a single button, the Listen to Copied Audio button in the top right corner. When you press this, all channels on the desk that were routed from the stage racks are invisibly repatched to take audio from the playback. Then you can carry on working, EQing, setting monitor mixes and levels, as if the musicians are still playing. You don't have to repatch channels. All your processing and effect sends remain the same, and when you're done, pressing the blue button, now called Listening to Copied Audio, switches off this playback stream and you're back working with the live sources from stage. For more detailed information on the connection setups, see the Advanced Connections chapter. As you probably know, you can now run Waves plugins on the SD range of desks. While all of the control for the plugins is handled by the SD console, the audio processing is taken care of by a dedicated processor, the SoundGrid server. So, we need to be able to get audio to this server from the desk and also provide control information for adjusting plug-in parameters. A Waves-enabled SD9 has an additional Cat5 port. This port carries the audio to and from the console to the SoundGrid server. The control element of the Waves system uses the console's standard PC network connection. To combine these signals, standard PC networking hardware is used, a gigabit switch. So there are 3 connections: SD9 Waves port to the switch, SD9 standard PC network to the switch, and the SoundGrid server to the switch. The console has 5 different types of channel, all of which are color-coded according to their type. We'll look first at the light blue colored input channels. Touching any of these will assign the console's controls to that channel, and the strip will be displayed with a gold-colored background. The first controls at the top of the channel strip are the gain, trim, and phase polarity controls. The controls that you see depend on the type of input that is routed into that channel. If there is no input or a digital input such as AES routed, you will only see a blue trim control. This is the digital trim that is applied in the console audio engine. If an analog input is routed, you will also see a red analog gain control. This is actually just a remote control for the analog mic pre in the rack or on the console local I/O. The polarity button inverts the polarity of the incoming signal. On a stereo channel, it has 4 states that allow either or both sides of the stereo signal to be reversed. When there are both analog gain and digital trim controls in a channel, you should use the Quick Select Gain button and the screen scroll to get access to the trim. When an analog signal is selected, there is also a track button next to the trim which switches on what we call gain tracking. You might use gain tracking if you are sharing a rack with another console and they have control of the analog gain. This would normally mean that the levels of your inputs are potentially being changed by someone else. To avoid this problem, once a good analog gain level has been set, you could switch on gain tracking for the shared inputs, and then any gain change made by the other console will be automatically compensated by the digital trim on yours. With track switched on, you can actually see the trim control moving in the opposite direction to the analog gain whenever it is changed. Touching the top of the channel will then open the setup panel. At the top of the input channel setup panel, the first thing you will see is the mono and stereo selection buttons. All of the console's inputs are what we call flexi channels. This means that they can all be either mono or stereo in any combination. Just press the relevant button to select the type you require. If you have selected a mono channel, you can then use the channel's second input as an alt input. This allows you to have a spare mic patched into the same channel and switch to it with the press of a single button if there is ever a problem with the main mic. The spare mic signal will just pass down the same channel with the same processing as the main mic. Switching between the main and alt can be done with the 2 buttons just beneath the mono and stereo buttons, or with a macro, but you cannot switch to the alt input unless you have already routed a signal to it. To route a signal into a channel, just press one of the buttons labeled main input or alt input to open the input routing panel, and then select one of your racks in the left-hand column. Then select an input card for the middle column, and finally select a socket from that card in the right-hand column. As well as rack ports, there is a button marked internal, which contains all of the console's own input sources, such as the oscillator, effects, and other channels, groups, and auxes. You might want to route several consecutive inputs at the same time to give you a one-to-one patch for the whole rack. This is done with Ripple Route. Touch one of the predefined Ripple channel buttons to select a number, or touch the number itself to type it in. Now, just select the first input socket you require, and the next sockets will be routed into as many channels as you have chosen. According to the type of input that you have chosen, extra buttons such as Phantom Power or AES Source on and off will appear in the setup panel. If you have chosen a stereo channel, a number of other extra controls will also appear. These consist of balance and width controls for the stereo signal, automatic middle and side decoding, and switches to reverse the stereo image and send either side of the stereo signal to both left and right. Below these buttons, you can see the input channel's delay controls. They allow coarse or fine adjustment of the delay or the option to type in a delay time. The next thing in the setup panel is the channel name, which can be entered by touching and typing into the white box or selected from a list of predefined custom names by pressing the down arrow next to the label. Under the channel label are the safe switches for that channel. If you are using snapshots, you can select parts of the channel that will not be affected by any snapshot recall. Then, we have the Copy From and Copy To functions. If you press the Copy From button, you can then select the amount and the parts of the channel that you want to copy. With Copy From, you then select the first channel to copy from by pressing its work surface channel select button. This will take the settings from that channel and copy them to the channel that you are in. This function is normally used to copy the settings from one group of channels to another group of channels. The Copy To function works in a similar way, but this takes the settings from the single channel that you are in and copies them to one or several others. Use this if you want to have the same settings as a starting point in a number of different channels. The next thing in the setup panel is the Presets button. Pressing this opens a panel where you can save and recall single or multi-channel presets. With the settings that you want to save in this channel, just press the New button and type a name when prompted. Before continuing, touch the Channels column next to the name and type a number of channels to save in this preset. If you don't enter a new number here, the preset will automatically contain a single channel settings. You don't have to worry about which settings have been saved at this point, because in channel presets, all settings are saved automatically. All the presets that you create can be recalled into any other input channel by opening the Presets panel and selecting the preset that you want from the list. If you don't want all the settings to be recalled, just adjust the recall scope at the bottom of the Presets panel to include on the parts that you require. For example, you could just recall EQ and Dynamics and ignore the stored settings for inputs, aux sends, and group routing. If you store or recall a multi-channel preset, you need to remember that the channels are considered in numerical order. Therefore, if you store a multi-channel preset in channel 1 and specify 12 channels, you will get the channels 1 to 12 in your preset and not necessarily the channels that were physically next to channel 1 on the console at that time. Presets can also be organized into user-defined groups, updated and deleted in this panel. Another useful feature here is the Default button that can be used to reset all or part of the channel to its original flat settings according to the recall scope you select. The final thing in the setup panel are the solo settings. Using these buttons, the channel can be set to output to Solo 1, Solo 2, or both. The Auto Solo buttons allow you to ensure that the channel will always be soloed whenever any other console channel solo is switched on. To close the Input Setup panel, touch the Close button in the top right of the panel. Moving down the input channel strip, the next controls are the high and low pass filters. When the channel is assigned, these can be controlled with the rotary encoders on the right of the screen. Once the EQ has been switched on, the remaining 4 bands of parametric EQ can also be adjusted here, and by default, an expanded view of the EQ settings will pop up when you make an adjustment and close shortly afterwards. If you want to keep the EQ panel open for longer, just touch the EQ graph and it will stay open until you press the Close button. All the parametric EQ bands can be switched into dynamic EQ mode by touching the delta symbol on the left of each band. This will pop up an extra panel. The console allows up to 8 channels of dynamic EQ. So what is dynamic EQ, and why would you want to use it? In simple terms, it allows you to control the amount of EQ that you apply according to the level of the signal in the channel. So a low-level signal might not be EQ'd where a high-level signal was. You could even reverse that situation and have a low-level signal being EQ'd where a high-level one wasn't. If you think about what happens when a vocalist brings a microphone very close to their mouth, the signal gets louder, but there is also a bass boost in the signal. In that situation, you might want to put a low-end cut on the EQ. But if they move the mic away again, you won't want that cut anymore. A dynamic EQ will allow you to set a threshold level where the bass cut will start being applied, and then the more that the signal goes over that threshold, the more bass cut there will be. Obviously, there is a maximum limit to that cut, and this is represented by the setting that you have put on that band of EQ. When the signal comes back below the threshold, the bass cut is no longer applied. All of this is done in dynamic EQ over mode, which you will see indicated in the panel. The reverse of the situation that we described before would happen in under mode. To switch the dynamic EQ on, you use the Dynamic On button, and the EQ band can be temporarily bypassed for A-B comparisons with the band On-Off button. Remember to switch the band back on when you have used this function, as that EQ band will have no effect at all unless it is active. You can also control the attack, release, and ratio settings for the dynamic EQ in the same way as you would with a compressor. All of this can be done by touching the on-screen controls and using the rotary encoders and switches below the screen. Going back to the standard EQ panel, you will also see a button to set the EQ gain controls flat, an EQ safe button to prevent the EQ being affected by snapshot recall, and another way to access the presets panel to store your favorite EQs. The order of the EQ and dynamic sections in the input channel can also be changed here using the EQ DYN button. Above the EQ and below the dynamic sections of the input channel, you'll see insert points A and B. Only one of these can be used at a time, but you can choose the position in the signal path that you require. To route a channel signal to an internal or external processor using an insert point, you just need to touch the insert point on the screen and the Channel Outputs panel will open. You can then select which insert you want to route at the bottom of the panel and press the Insert Send button to open the routing panel. You will see the standard routing pop up, but if you are routing to an internal processor, such as a graphic EQ, you should press the Send and Return button before actually selecting a route. This means that selecting a Send to say Graphic EQ1 will automatically make the return route from Graphic EQ1. Then, all you need to do is to switch the insert on using the Insert A button on the work surface to the right of the screen. Inserts can also be ripple routed in the same way as channel inputs. Beneath the EQ section, you'll see the channel dynamics. This consists of a compressor and a gate, but on up to 8 channels, the compressor can be used in multiband mode with 3 adjustable bands of compression and a gate. Basic dynamics controls are in the normal place next to the screen, but if you touch the dynamics area on screen, the panel will expand. You now have control of the dynamics settings with the under-screen rotary encoders and switches. You'll find all the standard compressor controls here, but also an auto gain function that will automatically adjust the output gain according to the setting of the threshold control. The gate controls include a side chain filter with frequency and width to fine-tune the signal that is triggering the gate, and a key input option to use a separate source to independently trigger the gate. Pressing the multiband button will expand the panel to include 3 bands of compression. Each of these can work independently to allow very precise processing of different elements of the signal. The crossover frequency controls determine the bands that will be affected. The All On button is the on-screen equivalent of the work surface Comp On button. Continuing on down the channel, the next section is the auxiliaries. The number of these that you have is determined by the structure of the session, which is covered in the Getting Started section of this tutorial. On the work surface, you will see up and down scroll buttons to the bottom left of the screen that allow you to navigate through the different AUXs, and then you just need to press the Quick Select button for AUX and touch the AUX that you want to adjust on the screen. The rotary encoder and switch below the screen are now the AUX level and on-off switch. Stereo AUXs also have an AUX pan control, and this can be adjusted by switching on second function and using the under-screen control as before. With second function active, the under-screen switch allows you to change the AUX send from pre to pre-mute or post-fader mode. There is also an option on the master screen Options Solo tab that allows the faders to be used as controls for the AUX sends. With this option on, soloing an AUX master will automatically allow fader control for the related AUX sends. The bottom section of the channel contains the pan and the output routing controls. To adjust a pan, you just press the Quick Select Pan button next to the screen, and the under-screen controls become pans. The switch is a pan reset button to quickly go hard left, center, or right. If you are using an LCR master bus, this is also where you can adjust the blend of center signal that you need. Minimum blend means that the signal will only go to the left and right outputs, and maximum means that the signal can be sent to only the center output as required. This blend control is another one that needs the second function button to be pressed, and then you just use the normal pan control to adjust it. You have already seen the channel outputs panel when we looked at the insert points, but touching the bottom of the input channel is another way to open it. Here, you have the group routing buttons divided into mono, stereo, and LCR sections, and a direct output button that opens a routing panel for the output of the channel. Once a route has been selected, this output can be switched on or off, adjusted for level, and switched pre or post fader. If the selected rack output has a pad function available, it can be switched on here. Ripple routing is also available in the normal way. That's all of the controls on the input channel screen. So let's move on to the LCD button functions that allow you to do a number of other things with the multi-purpose channel select buttons and displays just above the faders. If you press one of the LCD function buttons on either side of the console, you will see the displays on that console section change to show you the functions available. The first of these is Solo, and this is actually the button that you would use to take this section back to standard operation mode. The silver buttons are, of course, normally solo buttons. The second function is Solo Choice, and pressing this will then allow you to select whether this channel will send to Solo Bus 1, Solo Bus 2, or both together. Each press of the Channel Select button will change the option as you will see in the display. As you have already seen, this particular option is also available in the Channel Setup panel. To return to the LCD functions again, just press the LCD function button once. The third button is used to create gangs. A gang is just a selection of channels from the same console section that are linked to each other, so that anything you do to one of the gang members is also applied to the others. That doesn't mean that all the gang members must always be the same. You can introduce offsets between them and have any changes that are made to one of them apply relatively to the others. So, if you start with the fader of one gang member at -10 dB and another at 0 dB, and then apply a 5 dB boost to one of them, they will both move and end up at -5 dB and +5 dB. To introduce an offset, you can temporarily isolate the gang members from each other by pressing the Work Surface Option button, and the controls can now be adjusted independently. Pressing the Option button again activates the gang again. This linking applies to all the channel controls except the phase switch, the phantom power switch, panning, and input and output routing. To gang channels together, you just press the gang button, and then select the members of the gang by pressing their channel select buttons. Then press the LCD function button again to return to the LCD button options. But remember that you can only gang channels together if they are in the same section of the console, the left or the right. The next LCD function is Join CG, but this can only be used if you are in a control group bank. If you press this button on a control group channel, you can then press a channel select button to choose which control group you wish to join. At this point, all of the other input and output channels on the console will show the control group's number in their channel display. Pressing any of the channel select buttons will join it to the control group that you first selected. There are other ways to create control groups, so please take a look at the master screen section of this tutorial for more information. We then come on to the Assign Faders function. Although the SD9 normally has a standard layout with all the different types of channel in banks on the work surface, you can move these channels around so that they appear in any combination anywhere. You can even have the same channel appearing several times in different places on the console. If, for example, you wanted to put all the various elements of a drum kit, including its reverb sends, returns, and control group in the same bank, you could use Assign Faders to do that. From the LCD function options, press Assign Faders and then press a Channel Select button to choose which fader you want to assign. Now switch to the master screen and open the channel list from the layout menu. Here, you'll see a full list of all the channels on the console. There is a section for each type of channel, so press the down arrow on the section that you need and then press the entry for the fader that you want to assign to the work surface. If you now go back to your original bank, you will see that a new channel has appeared and the previous one has been removed. The channel that has been removed will now show as unassigned in the channel list, unless it was already somewhere else on the surface as well. You can also assign a number of faders at the same time by pressing several channels select buttons and then choosing the first one that you want to assign from the channel list. If you want to clear channels to make space for other ones, or maybe you just want a few specific faders in one bank, you can use the Unassign Faders function. All you need to do here is to press the Unassign Faders button and then press the Select button for the channel that you want to clear. You will then see the screen channel strip go grey. Be careful with this one, because even though the channel is no longer on the surface, it could still be passing audio. You may want to reassign it somewhere else, or stop it passing audio before unassigning it in the first place. To copy a bank to another location, select the bank that you want to copy and then press the LCD function named Copy Bank To. Now press the bank button for the destination and you will then have two copies of the same bank. To copy a bank from a different location, select the destination bank and then press the LCD function named Copy Bank From. Now press the bank button for the source of the copy, and once again you will have two copies of the same bank. You can also use the master screen channel list to select the first channel in the new bank. This is useful if you have accidentally removed a bank from the work surface completely and want to get it back. Finally, to clear one of the copied banks, select the one that you want to clear and then press the Clear Bank function. You will be prompted to confirm by pressing the Yes button, and that bank will then be emptied of its channels. There are three types of output bus channel: aux outputs, which can be mono or stereo; group outputs, which can be mono, stereo, or LCR; and matrix outputs, which are mono only. On the SD9, the mono channels of any bus type will always appear before the stereo or LCR channels. Your master bus will always be your first stereo or LCR group. All three bus types have the same available channel processing. There is a digital input trim with a range of -20 dB to +60 dB and a phase or polarity switch. On a stereo bus, this switch toggles the polarity of both legs of the bus in the following order: left and right, then just the left leg, and finally just the right leg. A delay of up to 1.3 seconds can be applied to the channel using a combination of both the micro, millisecond, and samples controls. The samples control is accessed by pressing the second function button. Next, there are both high and low pass filters with a 24 dB octave slope with a full 20 Hz to 20 kHz range. The EQ section has 4 bands of full parametric EQ. Each band of the EQ can have dynamic EQ enabled, providing the necessary dynamics EQ resources are available. The SD Dynamics section features a compressor and a gate. The compressor can be switched to a multi-band. Again, only if you have the necessary resources available. As with input channels, the EQ and dynamics processing order can be reversed using the EQ DYN on-screen button located at the bottom of the EQ panel, or using the work surface button in the channel processing controls section. There are also 2 insert points on each channel, one pre-EQ and dynamics and one post-EQ and dynamics. Only one of these insert points can be used at any one time. By touching the top of any selected output channel, you open the Setup panel. Within the Setup panel, you are able to name the bus with either the keyboard or from the custom names list, turn on and off individual channel recall safes, access the output channel presets control panel, and choose whether the signal is monitored by Solo 1, Solo 2, or both. The copy from and copy to functions are also accessed from here. The group and aux output channels have additional controls within the Setup panel. First, let's look at the Group Setup panel. The top of the Group Setup panel shows a list of the input channels that are routed to that group. The Input Channels list can be scrolled if necessary using the bar on the right-hand side. If you touch an input channel fader and that channel is routed to that group, the channel name will be highlighted in the list. Underneath this list are 2 buttons labeled Clear All and Connect All. The Clear All button clears all the input channel routes to the selected group, whereas the Connect All button will route all input channels to the selected group. Touching any of the input channel faders while pressing the Clear All or Connect All button will prevent the route-unroute operation for those input channels. The top of the aux setup panel contains several configuration options for the selected aux channel. The 3 buttons on the top left of the panel will globally set the send point for that aux's channels. This can be pre-mute, pre-fader, or post-fader. The default setting in a new session is post-fader. This setting can also be individually changed at channel level. On the right-hand side of the panel are the aux to fader and aux to rotary buttons. If it is a stereo aux, there is also a Link Pans button. The Link Pans control links the selected aux pan to the channel pan of the input channel. If you select this function, the button will turn red and the aux pan slider on the input channel strip will turn pink. The next 2 control options are aux to fader and aux to rotary. Pressing aux to fader will assign control of the input channel sends of the selected aux to the input channel faders. Similarly, pressing aux to rotary will assign the input channel aux sends of the selected output to the underscreen rotaries. Underneath the controls we have just talked about are the purple Copy Level From buttons. Pressing either the off or 0 dB buttons will globally set the sends to this output to the selected level. The Faders button copies the mix levels of the current fader positions to the aux send levels. Pressing any of the other options copies the channel send levels from that aux and applies those levels to the selected aux, effectively duplicating that mix. Uniquely, AUX output channels have a talk function on the control strip. This allows you to talk to both individual and multiple AUX outputs without having to use up an input channel. This is accessed either by selecting the AUX Quick Select function, which assigns the talk control to the underscreen rotaries, or by predefining groups of AUXes in the talkback panel. Next to the level control, you'll notice that there is a dim control, which is accessed using the second function key. This will reduce the level of the bus output by the set amount, allowing communication without increasing the overall volume of the output. Continuing down the channel, the next control is the FX output button. Press this and the FX presets panel will open. Select the desired effects from the list, and providing one of the 8 slots is free, that FX will be added to your rack and a bus will be routed to the FX. Once routed, touching on the screen just under the FX output button will open up control for that FX and assign the controls to the underscreen rotaries. This function is not available on LCR buses. Finally, on the output strip, touching the bottom of the channel will open the Outputs panel. From here, you can set up your Insert A or Insert B routing, access the Effects Output function, or directly route the channel to internal resources or to local or rack outputs. This section of the DVD will cover the snapshots section of the SD9. There's a lot to cover here, but we'll try to keep it as simple as we can. So why would you want snapshots? In short, they allow you to automate changes to your desk. These could be simple mute or fader changes from song to song, or more complex changes involving crossfades, firing MIDI, or controlling external playback machines. We'll start with the basic controls, then move on to some more involved programming examples. To start, open the Snapshots panel using the button on the master screen. The window that opens has all the controls necessary to make and edit snapshots. There are also work surface controls that give access to the more commonly used controls. The basic operation of snapshots is very simple. Each time you make or update a snapshot, the desk stores a complete picture of the desk, the position and state of every controller, pot, button, and fader. This ensures that nothing is missed. Then, as you recall or fire the snapshots, the controller positions are brought back to the surface. There are 2 final buttons that we skipped over on the right-hand side, both of which relate to snapshot groups. These are the Update Group button and the Relative Groups button. So what's the point of snapshot groups? Grouping snapshots together allows us to update them relative to a set of rules that we can define. We can either make a single big group that contains all the snapshots in the list, or we could make smaller groups of snapshots. Once snapshots have been added to a group, the group is just a consecutive selection of snapshots. The updating of snapshots in a group can happen in 2 ways, either relatively or absolutely. Probably the easiest way to explain this is with some examples. So I'll start with a list of 10 snapshots, and then, using the Add to Group button, I'll add each of them to the group and also press the Relative Groups button. All the snapshots should now have red text, except the currently selected snapshot, which will have green text. Now, as we make changes to the console parameters, we can either update the snapshots individually or we can update the group. Taking a single fader as an example, I've programmed it to have a slightly different value for each snapshot throughout my list of snapshots. So, as I fire up and down the list, you can see the fader move. Now, if we go back to snapshot 1 and pull the fader down 10 dB, and this time I press Update Group, that fader will be adjusted relatively by 10 dB in every snapshot. That is, have 10 dB taken off its value in every snapshot. Now when we fire through the list, the same relative adjustments are made from snapshot to snapshot, but with 10 dB taken off every value. This relative adjustment can be made to any level-based controller, faders, aux sends, EQ band gains, for example. But in practice, the most commonly adjusted controllers are faders and aux sends. Imagine you're a monitor engineer, and at the top of a show, you need to dial in a change in level for a mix for every song in the set list. If you have all your snapshots in a single group, you can tweak the level, press Update Group, and know that the change is made while retaining the required program differences. Instead of updating groups relatively, a similar group update can be performed but in absolute mode. Whereas the group update we've just looked at is performed relatively, the absolute mode works slightly differently. You'll notice that blue text is used to show absolute groups instead of the red for relative groups. Looking at faders again, I've programmed 5 snapshots where a fader sits at 0 dB in 3 of the snapshots and 10 dB in the other 2 snapshots. If I fire snapshot 1, where the fader is at 0 dB, I'll move it up to plus 5 dB. This time, when I press Update Group, only snapshots where the original fader value matched the current snapshot will be updated. The result is that the snapshots that had a fader value of 0 dB all now have a fader value of plus 5. And the snapshots that had a fader value of minus 10 remain untouched. So to recap, only snapshots in the group that have an identical value are updated with the new value. Again, this absolute group update applies only to dB-based level controls, aux sends, gains, faders. Just before we move on from the group update functions, we should mention what happens when non-level-based controllers are adjusted. So this might be frequency controls on an EQ band or dynamics controls. In both relative and absolute modes, these non-level controllers act the same. When the group update button is pressed, only values in snapshots which match the controller being adjusted are updated. This means that, in practice, non-level controllers always follow the absolute group update rules, and it is only the dB or level-based controllers that behave differently in relative mode. Now let's make our first snapshot. Press the Insert New button at the top right corner of the Snapshots window, and the snapshot is made. It immediately prompts for a name, so enter a name and hit Enter. There's a Surface button for making a new snapshot too. So if we change some fader positions and press the Surface Insert New button in the Snapshot section, a new snapshot is made, storing the new fader positions. Using the Fire Previous and Fire Next buttons, either on screen or on the surface, we can toggle between these two snapshots. In the snapshot control section of the work surface, there are scroll up and down buttons that select snapshots up and down the snapshot list. Once the required snapshot is selected, pressing the Fire button recalls that snapshot. You'll notice that as you scroll up and down the list, the selected snapshot is highlighted with green text, whilst the current or last recalled snapshot is highlighted with the white background. Once changes have been made to a snapshot, we need to store them by updating the snapshot. Usually the snapshot you're updating is the snapshot you're in. So once the changes have been made, you can press either Update Current or Update Selected. Once you've tweaked your session and all your controls are in the right position, you might want to write those settings to another snapshot in the session. Maybe you started with a working base snapshot as a starting point, but the new settings you have would work better. So instead of pressing the Update Current Snapshot button, you can select a different snapshot to update. To do this, either touch a snapshot in the list or scroll up and down using the surface buttons and then press Update Selected. However, remember that the snapshot that you update will be updated for every setting, completely overwriting the settings previously stored. That covers the basic principles of making and recalling snapshots, so now would be a good time to look at some of the other buttons in the panel. Down the right-hand side are buttons which perform actions on the snapshots. Some of them are obvious. Rename is used for renaming snapshots. Renumber renumbers the snapshot list. To delete a snapshot, touch Delete, then select one or more snapshots to delete, then press the red Confirm button. While we're looking at this delete function, you'll notice that a small window opens showing Select Range, Select All, Confirm, and Cancel buttons. When we're deleting or editing snapshots, we can select individual snapshots, a range of snapshots, or all the snapshots to edit or delete. The only one that needs a little explanation is the Edit Range option. This lets you edit or delete a group of consecutive snapshots. Press Edit Range, then touch the snapshot that is the beginning of the group to be edited. Then select the last snapshot of the group, and all the snapshots in between are selected. When we're editing snapshots, this Edit Range function is commonly used to make changes to a group of snapshots. You might need to push just one fader up in all your snapshots, leaving everything else as it was, or change a single awk send value in just a few snapshots, again leaving all the other programming intact. If we go into Edit Range and select just some of the snapshots in the list, now any changes made in the session will only be written to the selected snapshots. Once the changes have been made, we press the Confirm button to write those changes into the selected snapshots. Remember that only controls that are adjusted while you're in this edit mode are modified. The rest of your programming is left untouched. It's worth remembering that the Edit Range function has to be selected before the changes are made on the console. It's not a retrospective command. Looking again at the buttons down the right-hand side, just underneath the Insert New button that we first used, is the Duplicate Selected button. If you want to make an exact copy of a snapshot that already exists, touch a snapshot or scroll to select one, then press the duplicate selected. The new duplicate snapshot will be inserted immediately after the original one. You could then move it using the Move function. Press Move, then select the snapshot to be moved, maybe the one you've just created using the Duplicate function, then touch on the list where you want it to go. Then, at the bottom of the right-hand side is the Touch to Fire button. Pressing this changes the size of the text in the snapshot list. And now, when you touch a snapshot in the list, it fires straight away rather than just selecting it. So, there are only a couple of final snapshot options that need to be mentioned. The Notes button allows you to add text notes to each snapshot, as a reminder when you are mixing the show. When open, the Notes panel floats above all screens, so it's always visible no matter which screen you are looking at. The Crossfades button opens the Crossfades window. And here, we can set individual parameter crossfade times on a channel-by-channel basis. Then, when a snapshot is fired, the settings morph over the crossfade time. These time values can be set differently for each snapshot, and set the speed at which the crossfade occurs when that snapshot is fired. For example, if you want the faders to take 2 seconds to reach the correct position when moving from snapshot 1 to snapshot 2, you would enter a crossfade time of 2 seconds for the faders in snapshot 2. The Recall Times function sets 2 time-related parameters. The first column, duration, is how long a snapshot lasts before the next snapshot is automatically fired. Using this function, you can program an exact timed sequence of parameter changes. Touch the duration field, then enter values using the time parameters at the bottom of the panel. Fractional second values can be set in either frames or as a decimal value. When you fire a snapshot that has a specific duration programmed, a progress bar in the main snapshots window indicates how long before the next snapshot is automatically fired. If you want to stop countdown, touching the Duration Active button will pause the progress bar and halt the automatic firing of the next snapshot. Pressing the Duration Active button again restarts the countdown to firing the next snapshot. Up to this point, all the storing and recalling of snapshot information has recalled pretty much every setting on the desk. As we said at the beginning, when you make or update a snapshot, every setting or parameter is stored. When we fire snapshots, it may be that we don't want to recall all the information. We may want to filter it so that only some parameters are recalled. We do this through the use of scopes. There are several scopes, so let's have a look at each of them. The first scope to set is the Global scope. Touching the Global Scope button opens up Scope window. The basic idea with the scopes is that anything with a green tick will be recalled, and anything with a red cross will not be recalled. It's divided up into categories, channel type, and functions within the channel. You'll notice that for each module, input, delay, filters, EQ, etc., there are two columns, recall and update. The recall column determines if settings will be recalled when a snapshot is fired, and the update column determines if settings will be updated when the update group button is pressed. It's probably easiest to see this with a real example. So I've set the global scope as follows. Looking at just the input channels row, these are the recall and update settings just for input channels. You can see that the delay, inserts, group routing, and output routing are not set to recall. The red crosses in the recall columns set this. So when any snapshot is fired, these items will not change, essentially becoming manual controls on the surface. Only items with ticks, EQ, dynamics, aux sends, faders, etc. will change with snapshot programming. I've also set the group update scope so that only input trim, aux sends, and faders will be updated by the group update function. So earlier, when we were updating groups, either absolutely or relatively, only the channel parameters that are ticked here will be updated, and the other channel settings will be unaffected by the group update action. In addition to this global session-wide scope setting, there are two more scopes that affect the recall and group update of snapshot settings. Pressing the scope button on the left-hand side expands the number of buttons and allows access to more advanced snapshot functions. The first two buttons in this extra column of buttons are Recall Scope and Group and Auto Update Scope. These two scopes act in the same way as the global scope, but allow for more control. Whereas the global scope was an overall scope setting for the whole session, these advanced recall and group update scopes allow us to set scopes in more detail. Taking the recall scope as an example, we can set the scope to control the recall of settings on each channel, but on a channel-by-channel basis. So, if you wanted the faders to recall on channel 1, but not on channel 2, setting the appropriate ticks and crosses for each channel allows this exact level of control. And as if this wasn't enough, you can then set the recall scope to be different for each snapshot. So you may have some snapshots that should recall specific channel settings and other snapshots that should not. By setting each snapshot's recall scope, this advanced level of programming is easily set. But because of this detailed level of control, it's important that you don't overcomplicate your settings. It's best to start with setting the global scope first, choosing which items you want to recall or group update. Then, as you need to make per channel per snapshot changes, use the recall scope and group update scope. Setting these individual scopes too early could lead to unnecessary confusion. Below these advanced scopes buttons, there are a number of other options that add functionality to snapshots. The SD9 can be linked using the PC's network connection to another SD9 or a standard PC computer running the console offline software. The setup of this networking connection relies on standard Windows XP networking protocols, but there are a few setups to check before it can be used. Open the Options panel from the master screen. Select Session tab and make sure that the Enable Console Network option is to Yes. If you've had to enable the console network from the master screen, open up the console network panel. The panel that opens is split into two sections. The top half deals with actual consoles that can be networked together, and the bottom half will list available PC remotes. To the right of the remote section are a series of buttons that perform actions on selected remotes or consoles. So, in the top half of the window, you will see that your SD9 will probably have its network ID set to A. And in the light blue box underneath this, there will be details relating to your console, console name, and more importantly, its IP address. This will conform to standard Windows networking addresses, for example 192.168.2.46. If you intend to link a remote PC to the SD9, you will need to set its LAN IP address to be fixed in the same range. So using the previous example, if the console has an IP set to 192.168.2.46, your PC would need an IP of something like 192.168.2.100. We recommend disabling any wireless connections on your PC remote. This improves stability in the networking connection to the console. Once you have your PC's IP address set correctly, you connect the console and the PC together using a network crossover cable or network switch. Turn them both on and launch the offline software on your PC. When you open the network panel on the console, your PC remote will be listed in the remote section in the lower half of the network panel. From your SD9, you can now select your PC remote and transfer or synchronize your session to the PC remote. Once the sessions are the same, the Mirror to Selected button becomes active. Pressing this mirror button finishes the process of linking them together. Your SD9 can now be remotely controlled from your PC. Now the console and the PC remote are mirrored together, every parameter adjustment, change of EQ, fader move, mute action occurs on both devices. You can operate either device, or two people could work on different elements of the session at the same time. For example, you could be labeling input channels on the console while someone else dials in matrix EQs using a laptop. This network connection also provides all the metering information to the laptop, so you can really see how your remote adjustments will affect the signals. You can link two SD9 consoles together in the same way. This mirroring of two consoles together provides several benefits. With two consoles running the same session, you have double the work surface and a total of 48 faders. But it also provides a level of redundancy. If one of your work surfaces or engine should have a problem, the other surface or engine is online, allowing you to continue mixing the show, no loss of control or loss of audio. There is one setup difference that's worth noting when mirroring together two SD9s. On each console, open up the network panel on the master screen and make sure they have different network IDs. One of them should be set to A and the other should be set to B. Apart from that, the operation is the same. Select the other console using the Select button, transfer the session, then mirror together using the button. While all of the SD consoles have this mirroring functionality, only consoles of the same type can be mirrored together, so the SD9 will only mirror to another SD9 or PC remote. Once you're familiar with the basic connections on the SD9, there are some advanced configurations that require a little more explanation. These include the sharing of racks, advanced synchronization settings, and the setup of the network for remote control. Let's start with the sharing of racks. The SD9 to DRAC Cat5 connection is a single point-to-point connection between the console and the remote rack. There will be times when it would be useful to be able to share a rack between two consoles, maybe a front of house and a monitor setup. Sharing the rack would mean that only a single rack is needed and no analog splits are required, simplifying the setup. In order to share a DRAC between two SD9s, you will need to use a little red box. This box is part of the range of Digico solutions, small format conversion and sharing boxes that allow multiple consoles to share a rack. The little red box specifically allows a rack, either a Cat5 connected DRAC or any of the Digico MADI connected racks, to be shared between two SD9s. At this stage, it's probably useful to understand a little bit of the terminology used in rack sharing. You'll hear these phrases used whenever we talk about rack sharing. If a console is in control of a rack, so that it is in control of gains, phantom power settings, and able to route audio to the outputs on the rack, that console is in full connect or full control. However, if a console is sharing a rack and only able to accept inputs from the rack and unable to control the rack or output audio from the rack, it is referred to as being in receive only. When we set the shared status of racks in the audio I/O panel, they are set up using these two terms, full control and receive only. There's a third expression, isolate. If a shared rack is set to isolate, you are completely disconnected from the rack in terms of control data. The flow of audio from the rack to the console is not affected by these modes. It is only the control mode that is being set. So going back to our shared rack example, if we connect up a red box using two SD9s and a DRAC, 3 connections are required. A Cat5 from each console to the box, and a third Cat5 that links the rack to the box. The SD9 plugged into the full connect port has full control of the rack and can access the outputs of the rack. The SD9 plugged into the RX only port is in receive only mode and only has the inputs from the rack. Using the same setup, you can share a MADI connected rack. Just flip the switch on the little red box to MADI, and the MADI connected rack is then shared between the two SD9s. Once you've made the cable connections, the connections need configuring within the software. On the master screen, touch the Setup menu and select Audio I/O. Select the rack to be shared in the list of ports. Then select the Splits and Sharing button. By default, the rack is not set as shared, so press the Shared button to share the rack. It immediately switches to isolate mode. You can then set it to receive only or full connect, according to how you are physically connected to it. There's one additional element that will affect your ability to set your shared rack status into full control or receive only. If you open the network panel from the master screen, there is a button called Audio Master. Normally, when you are running as a standalone console, this button serves no purpose, but when sharing racks, this button needs to be set correctly. If you are the console that is in full connect, the Audio Master button needs to be pressed down. If you are the console that is in receive only, then this button should not be pressed. It's easy to tell if it's pressed or not by its color. Yellow is pressed. Blue is not pressed. Now you're all set up with your shared rack. If you're the fully connected console, you have control of the head amp gain. That's the mic amps in the connected rack. And if you're the receive-only console, you can't adjust the mic amp gain. If you try, the pot just doesn't move. However, if the other console makes an adjustment to the gain, that change is transmitted back to you, so your mic gain pot will correctly show the actual level set. So imagine you're on a monitor console and you're in receive only. The engineer at front of house makes an adjustment, and because you're sharing the same mic amp, his adjustment will affect your audio levels. This might be okay, but will also affect other levels within your console. Your monitor mixes might change or dynamics thresholds affected. You can protect yourself against this using our gain tracking system. Once enabled on the channels, it automatically compensates for adjustments made to the mic amp gain by moving the digital trim in the opposite direction. For example, the front of house guy adds 6 dB to the mic amp gain on channel 27. If gain tracking is enabled on that channel, your digital trim would reduce by 6 dB, and the result is that the audio level entering channel 27 does not change. The standard SD9 system comes inclusive with a D-rack. This rack frame can be used as a stage floor rack or fitted with optional 19-inch rack ears and rack mounted. The D-rack provides 32 mic or line inputs from stage and can have up to 16 outputs in the following formats: line out, AES out, or Aviom outputs. The SD9 can have up to 2 D-racks connected to the work surface. Each connection is a single Cat5 that can be run up to 100 meters from the surface. More about this is covered later in this startup guide. It is also possible to connect standard MADI-based Digico rack frames to the surface on the provided single MADI connection. Alternatively, this can be used for recording. Please see Basic Connection section of this video for details on this option.